Good afternoon and welcome to this Flinders University's Fearless Conversation on Reconciliation for Our Future. My name's Jane Doyle, I'm from Channel 7, I present the news there, and I'm pleased to be facilitating this discussion today, which is supported by Flinders University Fearless Conversation partners, The Advertiser, Channel 7, Hither and Yon, and Uni Super. Now today our fearless discussion is around the thorny topic, shouldn't be that difficult, but it apparently is, the thorny topic of reconciliation and how we can continue advancing the participation of Indigenous people in higher education and beyond. We'll also look to challenge or to examine challenges faced by the Indigenous community and how we must come together to ensure better outcomes and improved rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And today we welcome a group of important leaders and very well researched and thoughtful people who are going to help us with this difficult but fearless conversation. So to begin with today, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and that we respect leaders past, present and emerging. And we also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all nations upon which Flinders University operates. Now, we've encouraged you to join the conversation via this new platform that I've never heard of called Slido, but also please participate on Twitter using the Fearless Conversations hashtag as well. Now, it's a very great pleasure for me to be amongst a peerless group of people today to share this conversation. The Honourable Kyam Maher, South Australia's Attorney-General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, joins us. I'd welcome also Associate Professor Simone, who in 2020 was appointed as Flinders University's inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous. Simone is from up around Oodnadatta, the Yankajara area community in northwest South Australia, and in her role at Flinders is responsible for advancing Indigenous outcomes across education, research, employment and wellbeing at the university. So welcome, Simone. Besides Simone, I should also mention she also guides the Yugarendi Student Engagement, a Flinders University hub that supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to succeed. And we're all wearing, I might mention here, these beautiful pins, which are part of a mosaic, I understand, at the centre.
That's correct. It's been a 12-year project with our first-year students and staff where we have a tile project where we have a beautiful mosaic image. This one is actually part of the Drubuki or the ibis, and from them we've actually formed our beautiful wrap pins.
Yeah, and they're just gorgeous and each one's slightly different, so you might like to have a look at those. Now, next to Simone is another esteemed guest, Uncle Richard Fejo, a Larrakia and Warramunga man up around Northern Territory. So Larrakia, Darwin and Warramunga in the Tennant Creek area, and served as Senior Elder on Flinders University's campus in Darwin since 2020. So welcome, Uncle Richie. For 11 years, he was the Senior Cultural Educator at Northern Territory General Practice Education and co-chaired the Australian National Cultural Educator Cultural Mentor Network for 5 years. Uncle Richie's dedicated his life to cross-cultural education and improvement of outcomes for Aboriginal people. So we're delighted you could be with us today. He's also a brilliant stand-up comedy, I'm told, so stand by for that as well. And finally, please welcome Shona Reed, who's CEO of Reconciliation South Australia. Shona's a proud Eastern Arunta woman with a family legacy that extends into the Heart Ranges in the NT. And for 15 years has had a deep engagement with child protection, young offending and out-of-home care sector in mostly regional and remote areas, including the APY lands and the far west coast of South Australia. And she came to Reconciliation South Australia from the Legislative Council within the SA Parliament as the Executive and Research Officer for the Aboriginal Lands Parliamentary Standing Committee. So would you please welcome all of our 4 fearless conversationalists today. Now, I know we're all going to be brave and we're going to be fearless in the conversation, but I think when we start talking about reconciliation, I think we probably need to start with that word in itself and what it means. What does it mean for you, Kyam Maher? What does reconciliation mean to you as Aboriginal Minister, but as an Aboriginal man as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, Jane. The ordinary meaning of reconciliation is to bring things together after they've been apart but were together at one stage previously, which is almost a bit of a misnomer in terms of the reconciliation process. What it means at its most simple level for me, is a better understanding between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, creating the ability to have the shared knowledge and shared pride in the elements that make up this country, a respect for and a pride in having the oldest living culture this world's ever seen as part of this country, and that understanding, that knowledge, and that pride in what we are as a community now is, I think, fundamental when I think about reconciliation.
Shona, in our chat earlier, you said this is a conversation that we've been trying to have for 200 years and we haven't yet managed to get it. So I've never really thought about that, but Kyam, you're correct. It actually should be a conciliation conversation, perhaps.
Yeah, look, I think, if we look at the modern day, contemporary understanding around what reconciliation is and the brand reconciliation in general, we can get caught up in definitions of the word itself. And, there has been a strong legacy, and even the formation of current day reconciliation movement was formed on the basis of a broken treaty many, many years ago in the north of Australia. So, it is a complicated word, it's a complicated concept, but at its core root, if we get rid of and not get hung up on its, technical definition, it's about relationships. It's about, we really want to have a meaningful, sustainable, respectful, like Kyam was talking about, an honest relationship with each other, really, so our community can function at its most optimal level as a society overall. And that's not something that's, that we all, factions of communities want different things. That's what we all want. We all want a community to live and grow and bring our kids up in a healthy environment to prosper. And that's, if we don't get hung up on the definition of the word, that's essentially what it is. It's about a feeling, it's about a connection, and it's about relationships.
And Simone, do you have a different take or anything to add to that, or Uncle Richie?
I really do. I really support the idea of that it's a relational act. So I think at the heart of reconciliation, it is about people. It is about social movements. It's about change and incremental change as well. So there's a long vision to reconciliation. I don't actually think there's necessarily an end point to reconciliation. I think it's an ongoing process. I think I really recognise that it does mean different things for different people. And I agree, let's not get hung up necessarily on the definition, but let's think about what we can do in terms of our relationships, our processes and our structural reforms to actually build a stronger community, because as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we have a lot to offer our community. And if we have that shared relationship and understanding and commitment, it benefits the whole community.
You've been talking to all sorts of people for a long time, Uncle Richie. Do you feel that people are listening?
I think there is a social change in the direction, and I agree with what everyone's saying here. Where I come from, I tell a story about a freshwater stream, and the water comes up from the ground, and as the water turns into the river, it meets with the ocean. And so there's a mix of water from fresh water as it meets the salt water, and the water muddies when the tide coming in. But as it slows down, you can actually see distinction, and you can see where the two meet. And this is like a society, it's finding a place where we're comfortable with being ourselves. And it means being acceptable of all people and all people's traditions and customs so that we can be Australian.
It's a beautiful analogy, that notion of the saltwater people and the freshwater coming together and then being a bit mixed up for a time, but becoming clear and still being able to see the distinction. So Kyam, back to you. You're in government now, and we're about to have a federal election. I promise this isn't going to turn political, but we are. It is the context in which we meet today, that we have a federal government about to change or to be returned one way or another. You've just gone through that process. We now have your government in place. Where for you, as someone who is leading Aboriginal affairs in this state, where's the disparity? Where are the big gaps between what we all, I completely share your view, where's the gaps in the behaviour and in the enacting of what we want to be a shared community?
Yeah, I think there's one very, very, very big piece that I think sort of defines where the gap is, and that was almost 5 years ago, in a couple of weeks' time, when the statement from the Larue was handed down. And that was the culmination of the most comprehensive dialogue that Aboriginal Australia as a whole has had, and sort of set forward the next steps. The government of the day asked Aboriginal people, well, where are we now? And what are the next steps in the reconciliation process, but in Aboriginal affairs policy? And Aboriginal people said, well, in a remarkable act of togetherness and unanimity almost in terms of what the statement that came out and the steps that were taken, a voice to Parliament, a Makarrata Commission, an agreement-making process, and some sort of truth-telling process. So in my mind, it is not. It's not hugely complicated. We know how we go on the next steps of the journey in reconciliation, and in my mind, we've got that blueprint.
And we haven't done anything about it federally. Now, just to make clear, I know, Simone, you've been doing your research. So there has been a statement from the Labor Party that they will adopt the statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Liberals have said, nah. So that's where it stands in that sense. Do you share Kyam's view that an adoption by federal government of the Uluru Statement from the Heart would be a huge step forward for the country?
Absolutely. And I think what was demonstrated with the Uluru Statement of the Heart was Indigenous communities actually voicing their agency and saying this is what we want in order to actually contribute to our healthy communities, to build our aspirations, so have our voice represented. And so I actually think it's critical that we actually make that next step and actually have a voice to actually be able to engage and determine what our priority are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
And Shona, I think there's also, isn't there, in the general discussion, there's always this thing about what Indigenous people want, as if it's a common thing. The truth is there are as many opinions within the Indigenous community as there are in any community about what should happen and how it should happen. Is that what was so important about Uluru?
I think you're right, and it is absolutely the case that we are not we are quite a diverse, eclectic community overall, and I think we all represent our different beliefs, our different connections to country. We have grown up in different places and spaces, so we have different interests and different political views and different understandings. But I think what was really special about the Uluru Statement, the Uluru Gathering, and the many dialogues that happened outside of that for the culmination of that Uluru Statement to come to fruition, is that it catered for that. It catered for individual areas and not just organisations and allowed us voices to be heard, but it really asked community members to have their piece. What is it that you want? What drives you? What makes it so important? What are the things that are priority for you? And the Uluru Statement process and the dialogue process did that. And and I just want to also reiterate that the Uluru Statement was not actually ever delivered just to the federal government. It was delivered to every Australian, ordinary people, mums and dads, small business owners, educators, everyday people. It was a gracious invitation to take up and hear what First Nations people in Australia wanted. And it not only speaks to how our systems and how we govern as a country, it also speaks to how we govern as individuals. How do we enable First Nations voices to influence the work that we do, the information that we take in? How do we enable agreement-making processes? How do we seek out First Nations people to purchase our goods and services from? Do we seek out making arrangements with new and different people or communities? It doesn't have to be financial, it can be, reciprocal. Or how do we think about truth-telling in our country? And what's the truth of my family's relationship with First Nations people? So the Uluru Statement wasn't just about a political agenda. Yes, that is definitely part of it, and yes, we need constitutional enshrinement, but it's also speaking to every single Australian on whatever place or space that you occupy.
It's a good point, Shona, and it wasn't just a piece of work for the federal government to enact. I can remember about 2 years after it was handed down, sitting in the office of then opposition leader, Peter Malinauskas, now Premier, and we were talking about the Uluru Statement and the fact that we didn't have a federal government who agreed with it, and I think at that time the Labor Party just lost a federal election, so it wasn't going to happen much at all. And Peter just asked, what should we do, Kyam? And well, this isn't only about the federal government. So only a couple of weeks after that, the Peter Malinauskas, opposition leader, made a commitment that should we win state government, we would implement a state-based version voice treaty truth in a state-based context. So I think it is absolutely correct. This wasn't just something for a federal government. It was for governments of all levels. And I know local councils in South Australia are looking at how they get involved in parts of that. But for the whole of Australia, and it is a beautifully written one-page statement as well.
I was just going to say, it's a gorgeous document to read. I'm hoping that everyone in this room and everyone beyond that has read it. But it is a beautifully written document, and I think your use of the word gracious is very apt. It's a very gracious invitation to Australians, black, white and every other colour in between, to come together and have those conversations, whether they're on the corner store, at the corner store, over a dinner party, or indeed in our federal parliament. So, Kyam, I'm going to put the heat on you now. You're in government now, and you were in the portfolio yourself for 3 years under Jay Weatherall's government. What did you learn from that time, and what can you do differently this time, or what are you going to take from that time and move forward with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I was 3 years as the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. I've had the last 4 years as the Shadow Minister and back in government, the Minister again. So about 8 years in the portfolio. When we were last in government, for the last about 18 months, we'd committed to and started a treaty process. One thing that I think I've learnt from last time is the stop-start nature of policy in Aboriginal affairs. With the change of state government, the treaty process was stopped. We're back in, we're starting it up again. One thing I'm really conscious of and want to try and do is create the frameworks and the legislation around these sorts of things, particularly treaty that it survives the whims of a change of government. I think there are many of these areas that are too important to continually stop and starting. So I guess if there was one big thing, it's to do what we do in such a way that it becomes crucial, ingrained into what governments and the community does, and legislatively protected too, that it doesn't just stop and start.
It's embedded.
Yep.
I think it's a frustration across a range of portfolios, isn't it, that we see governments trying to reinvent the wheel, and everybody's renames everything, re-employs everything, spends a bucket of money changing things around and reprinting business cards as an analogy for it, and then starting again. It would be good to see the big conversations like reconciliation to actually carry through. That, I suppose, takes us to another area, and a specific one today about education and about the role that higher education for Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people, the role that has. In your time, Simone, have you seen a lot of change in that? Have we got better at getting more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into education, and particularly higher education and leadership roles that can change these big conversations?
I would say absolutely yes. So I've been in the higher education sector for over 20 years now, and from when I began in the late 90s to now, we've had over 400 alumni come through our particular university at Flinders. And Shona happens to be one of our distinguished alumni. In fact, I supported her when she was a student. So it comes full circle. And so that shows how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who, when they graduate, can make change to the conversation and to the social policies, to the work that we do in our controlled Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. Currently, we have around 366 students, and many of them are, about 300 of them are in undergraduate degree programs, and about 70-odd students are in postgraduate programs as well. And the key areas, the key areas that are in education, psychology, social work, social policy, in medicine and health. And so having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in these professions, of course, add to our whole community and particularly our own communities. From a teaching perspective, a teaching and learning perspective, education is probably a core element to actually shifting change. And I think when you talked about the statement from the heart and we talked about the graciousness of the document, but reconciliation is relational, you require knowledge to actually have those complex, truth-telling, honest conversations. And I think education can be the key to that. So I have seen shift. Do we need to do more? We always need to be doing more. But I think when I think about the proposed constitutional change in our up-and-coming federal government and the everyday citizen, the mum and dad, Shona, that you talked to about, really we need a broader educational campaign. So there's a demystification of perhaps fear that might be put into what a change might look like, and actually saying, actually, this is about coming together as a nation. This is about truth-telling. This is about race relations. So I think education and higher education in particular is a really important part of that process. I can say that in being in the sector for over 20 years and seeing graduates come through, our students are highly employable and have a lot to offer the community. But also in the teaching of non-Indigenous students, they're our champions as well.
And that's important too, isn't it? You've got a reconciliation plan at Flinders that came in 2020.
That's correct.
I think it was completed. How crucial or how important is that in the process, not just of offering opportunity to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island students, but also doing that other important work with non-Aboriginal people?
Well, I think for our university, it's been a really critical document. So it was ratified in 2020. We're about to go through a second process. But for me, and working with Professor Jonathan Craig as the co-chair of our RAP Oversight Committee, really taking that leadership, the championing. But what I think the shift has been for our university community, and it is a community, and communities contribute to change, is about centering Indigenous knowledges, worldviews, philosophies, our contributions that we can make to the university community has been really foundational. So that shift to centre our engagement is foundational, is what leads to sustainability. Instead of the constant change which you referred to, Kyam, as you embed it in the everyday conversations, in the structures as a priority of our institutions, that's when shift can be made, I think. So for me, I think it's been a really important process to engage our whole university community, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and our non-Indigenous students and staff.
When you're talking about embedding in community, there's also the small stuff, isn't there? There's the stuff like Adelaide City Council. I know you're a Northern Territory fella, Uncle Richie, but Adelaide City Council has made a policy of renaming and signing every public space in Adelaide with its original and proper name, Aboriginal name. I hear more and more people referring to Melbourne as Naarm. How important is that, Uncle Richie, do you think? The use of language, the gradual, I know it's got a long way to go, but the gradual reinsertion or re-emergence, if you like, of language in day-to-day Australia. Does that have a role as well, that sort of more specific and tiny work?
Absolutely. I think language refers to identity as well. So, we as Aboriginal people, language is central to our identity. So when we are on Kaurna land, as a Larrakia man from Darwin, I through protocols acknowledge the Kaurna people and the lands that they are on. So, part of that language is reflected through the respect of these type of actions, and that's Australia-wide. It's also important that we're teaching the young, so we're getting the change in social thought, to support Aboriginal people. We do have our leaders. We do have, we discussed, Uluru statement. We also discussed the students. These are people that are getting embedded in our community, and our knowledge just by being in the community and changing that social shift is actually beneficial for everyone.
Shona, the teaching of language is often horribly complicated by the fact that language has been driven out or been suppressed, and so there are not always people capable of teaching spoken language or written language for it. But do you think the teaching of language in our schools would be significant, and especially for Indigenous students, reclaiming their language?
Oh, look, and I'm not an expert in language. I don't speak my language, and I feel great loss that I have not able to learn my language. But I have a lot of kids. So I've got 7 kids.
Wow.
And 4 of them...
You need a medal for that.
I know, truly. Crikey. And 4 of them are still in school at this point in time. And it's really interesting. You raise your kids with pride in their history. You connect them to country, and you do your best in that space amongst all the other things you need to do as a mum and dad in bringing up kids and making them feel strong and grounded and well in their growth. And they look at me and they go, "Mum, what language do I pick when I go to school?" And your heart does drop a little bit as a First Nations parent around. Wouldn't it be wonderful that my kids could connect? It might not be our language, my language, Arana language, like it might not be ours, but Kaurna language. This is Uncle Richie's right. It is the centre. It's one of the centerpieces around a living culture, is a living language, and as Aboriginal, we form identities in different ways. I have my traditional owner identity and where I connect to in the country, and I've got my stories. I've got my totems. I've got the landscape in which I was born into. But then I've also got my identity as a community member here in South Australia, in Adelaide, and my connectivity to Kaurna people, my connectivity to Yankunytjatjara people. I have another identity, and so do my kids. And connecting with that is so important in building well children. And not only that, their wellness in interacting in their wider school community and creating an openness and an opportunity and I suppose brevity in a schooling environment to accept something that probably has been forced out of the community here for such a long time. And I think it is so very important. And there are pockets in South Australia. We do a lot of work in schools at Reconciliation SA, a lot of work around race relations, a lot of work around introducing Aboriginal topics into the curriculum. But there are only pockets that are popping up in our education system. And, there is some work being done around language revival, but that takes time. When you lose something, it takes time to rebuild. And I look forward to the day where you can choose it as an elective in high school and primary school. That would be, for me, acknowledging that, we are making steps. At the moment, it's few and far between, and I do get excited when I see it, and we all get excited when we hear a welcome to country and language or someone getting up and having a conversation, and I do look forward to the day that happens and our kids can freely and easily choose that as something that they are passionate about and can do as their education.
And if I can, just to say, I don't speak Larrakia language either, I only know a few words in Larrakia, but recently in Darwin, there was a 5-year-old book club in one of the Darwin libraries, and I helped them do a welcome to country in English. And it was just saying, the kids would go in there and say, I live on Larrakia land, I love Larrakia land, we take care of the sky, we take care of the land, and we walk on the same land together as a community. And it's an incredible joy, I mean, it's a step forward, and that's what we're trying to get across.
I'm struck by the thought of the parallels between, Australia is apart from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Australia is an immigrant culture. So we've come to your land, those of us who don't have Indigenous forebears, we've come to this land in one form or another at some point in our life. And the experience of otherness that was created for some of those migrants in times, given that the British were the first to establish, and then we had that post-war wave of migration. Do you see any parallels with that? You hear people now speak of being made to feel other, that their food wasn't accepted when they first came. This has been something that's been happening for Aboriginal people since time immemorial, since the whiteys turned up in the big ship with the white sails. Your culture has been dismissed. Is there a way of tapping in with that migrant experience, do you think, to help people understand what it feels like to be made to feel other in your own country? Am I expressing that clearly? Possibly not. I maybe haven't asked that well, but...
I'm
that's I'm trying to figure out who's answering.
It was an open question.
I think you're... yes, I think there's that perspective. I think the more interesting question is, where people arrive at different stages over time, and you're right, different waves of different people from different countries have come, yet the one consistent, and they have found a place in Australia. What I'd like to ask is, if we're going to be brave and fearless in this conversation,
please do be.
If that can happen in other communities and other new arrivals to Australia, why is it then First Nations people are still, after how many years? 200 odd years, still not made to feel comfortable, or still not able to feel comfortable in our country, yet other cultures from other areas have had that experience. They've had feeling new, having to join in, and then, eventually find a place 1 or 2 generations in. But First Nations people still, we are still not fully accepted in our country. We still have overrepresentation in all really difficult areas. We're referred to as wicked problems in our society, ostracised, overrepresentation in detention centres, child protection system, elder care system. So, look, getting into that brave and fearless conversations and beyond the polite ones, we have yet to feel welcome in a land that was ours to begin with.
Exactly.
And at what stage does that change?
And that's the brave and fearless thing, is to actually look at that and say, why? What? Why can't that happen? So what are the things that don't happen for you, Simone, that
and I think it's really good to flip the question that you've done. I mean, I've come from a personal family context where my father was a migrant, and obviously my mother is a Yankunytjatjara Undergadinya woman, was an Undergadinya Yankunytjatjara woman. And I mean, and when my father came to Australia in the 1950s, he was a citizen before my mother. So she was born through the assimilation era. And so the fact that we haven't actually come to terms with the racialised policies of this country based on the social construct and ideas of race is something I think that we actually need to come to terms with as a nation. No one should feel othered, but in the othering, I think what we need to do is look at who is doing the othering and returning the gaze back, and actually really reflecting and having a critical conversation of what it means to live in a society that privileges dominant ways of knowing, that privileges structures that are not the structures from the first peoples of this country. And, when you go back to the question about dual naming and presence, visible presence, it goes to whose knowledges are valued, whose memorialisms are most important in this country, whose stories are most valued. And so I think we need to actually have that fearless, critical conversation about when you go into these spaces, why is it that those who are doing the othered aren't being questioned?
Exactly. Kyam, that whole thing about the colonial past of Australia, have we done enough to acknowledge? Is there enough acknowledgement from those that did the wrong thing, or has that been put under the carpet? Has that been allowed and encouraged to be swept away as part of progress? The lack of willingness, the lack of enthusiasm to embrace the awful past that was imposed on Indigenous people. Has there been enough acknowledgement of that by Australia?
There's a really simple answer, and it's no.
No.
There just hasn't been enough, and it's exactly, our minds must have been turning on the same sort of ideas when Shona and Simone were talking. And I think that's part of it too, the way new and emerging communities from overseas sometimes find it quicker for acceptance than Aboriginal people who've been here for tens of thousands of years.
Well, there's no doubt. It usually takes a generation or two. And it's around food and it's around social custom.
And I think part of it is we don't reflect enough on some of the really, really difficult parts of our past. I remember really well, last time I was Aboriginal Affairs Minister, getting a call from the ABC inviting me to be part of a debate about a memorial that was proposed at Alliston on the West Coast, a memorial about the massacre in 1849 of Wirangu people. And at first I thought, it's the local council doing this, I'll stay out of it. Then I rang back about half an hour later and said, no.
No, I won't stay out of this.
I won't stay out of this.
Good.
It's important. And then it was a debate we really shouldn't be having. There was a debate over how many Wirangu were killed 170 years ago, and it missed the point completely. I understand it's not easy for people who've been on properties for 5 or 6 generations whose forebearers were involved in some of the massacres, some of the dispossessions, some of the killing of Aboriginal people. But unless you can acknowledge what's happened in the past, you really don't understand where we are. And if you don't do that, it's hard to move forward. It is essential to reconciliation that we do it better, and we don't do it very well.
How can we change that? How can we change that? I'm not asking you to, I'm not asking the Indigenous community to change that. What does white Australia have to do? What does Australia have to do to change that? We hear about it, we know about it, but is it just too hard? Why do we look away all the time, Uncle Richie?
So one of the things about being brave is actually acknowledging that there's some things that not everyone is aware of, or not everyone knows, or does not know how to encourage that space. And just that admission alone is actually being brave, because then you can actually start a learning journey, and you can start for everybody. There's a lot of beauty in Aboriginal culture all around Australia. And all you need to do is open your mind and your heart to go into that space, to be willing, to be brave enough to take that first step and to explore. And you start building relationships. And what happens is it comes back to you, it's reciprocal. So you become a part of that Aboriginal community, whether you're Aboriginal or not. You get almost adopted into the people. We're very welcoming people, Aboriginal people, and we want what's best for our community, particularly as community leaders. And so when you start to do this, you'll also see the Aboriginal leadership and how we function through governance. So me as an elder, as a Larrakia traditional owner, hold several high positions, and those dynamics can only be learned by going and seeing that space for yourself in the first place.
Shona, do you feel optimistic about the next 10 to 20 years in this space, or are you frustrated at times by the lack of pace of change?
I don't know if it's frustrations. I think your analogy, Uncle, before around the waters meeting and the muddiness, you know, I'll reframe that in terms of a mum with lots of kids. The only way to get a clean house is to make it really dirty to start with and then start, you know, going through. But I think the muddy water conversation is really interesting because there is a lot to go through, and, you know, it's important that it's walked. The footprints we leave for the future are really, really important, and how we leave those, just not the footprints, how we leave them and where we leave them, which means we are considered people. We choose words very carefully in our conversations. We choose our actions very deliberately. The eloquency of the Uluru Statement was not a coincidence. You know, we are, you know, very thoughtful people, and the process in defining a shared identity for the future is also something that's really thoughtful. And I am filled with hope in, you know, when I have conversations in the reconciliation space, I always have, what comes to me is, what can I do on an individual level? What can I do? I have privilege. I have grown up without, you know, without some of the hurdles that have been put in place for First Nations people. The systems that inhibited my development as a non-Aboriginal person haven't. I've benefited from the system and the dominant culture being there. What can I do with my privilege and own that to elevate, amplify, scaffold and provide space for First Nations knowledges, for creating new conversations and new opportunities. I see that on a daily basis. What needs to happen next is our systems and structures adapting to the will of community. Like, if you have a look at some of the research that's out there, especially undertaken by Reconciliation Australia in the last 2 years, there is an enormous movement around getting behind truth-telling, First Nations involvement in places and spaces, and ensuring that we've got a place at the table. There is a huge movement in our country, and if we went to a referendum, it is highly likely that that'll get through, even though referendums are really hard to win. The movement is there and the signals are there that were back in 67, absolutely categorically. The next part is, how does the system, the dominant culture system, move, and how does that change? That's the hard conversations, because probably the most privileged get to have a voice at that table. And until you know, the experts in that cultural knowledge can join that conversation, it's going to be a very hard thing to move. And that's why when I get excited, you know, when Kyam talks about state government and perhaps the next federal government that are talking about First Nations place at the table, that means conversations change. It's like, for instance, changing one word. Often I hear about First Nations issues all the time. I challenge you all to change the word issues to interests. It changes the conversation. It means we come from a different perspective. Our language is important. Our thought processes change, and that's where we need to go. And that's what I'm hopeful for as we go forward, is being able to change the narrative by including our voice at that place.
That was one of the questions that I was going to pose. As a privileged white woman, what can I do to make a contribution that is not gauche, inappropriate, misinformed, but what can I do? And I'm sure there's people watching this today and sitting in the room listening to this who are not of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island community, but feel very strongly that they want to engage in some practical Small, perhaps, bigger conversation. So what can we do? Uncle Richie, what can we do?
Okay, so for me, this answer is quite simple because I grew up in that environment. Being from Darwin and Larrakia country, saltwater country, I went to Mum's country, which is a desert country. My great-grandmother's country is Kakadu. When I go in those country, I've learned the cultural ways of learning. And the cultural ways of learning is what we are always told by our elders: look, listen, and learn. And so what we have to do as learners, when I was a young boy growing up, when our elders speak, we don't talk. You sit down and you listen to that story, what they've got to do. You support them in any way, you've got to support them. There's 100% respect for how we treat our elders on country. And this is what you can do. This is what you can do right here, right now in your community, is go to your local people and say, how can I reach out? How can I attend some of your gatherings? How can I listen to your voice? How can I hear what you're wanting to put across to us? And be patient and go. I've seen Simone talk in the park only a few years back, and it was a full place. It was like I couldn't get a seat, and I was so proud and happy to see that, because here we have Simone explaining to so many interested people about progression on Kaurna land. And that's what you can do. Get an interest. Become self-interested. It doesn't mean you have to have all the answers, because change, as we know, does not happen overnight. But over time, you become more familiar and more relaxed in that space.
Start a conversation.
I mean, I totally agree. I think educating yourself is a key to actually understand the country you're on. You should know what country you're on. You should know that we're on Gunayarta. And when you move through the country, you need to understand whose country you are on then. So I know I'm out of country. And so my respectful engagement with Kaurna people needs to be there as the custodians of this place. So I think education is the key, really engaging in critical reflexivity, thinking about your relationship with colonialism, the benefits as a consequence of the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their country. Shifting your discourse and language is really important. We do not need to be problematised all the time.
No.
And so shifting the language around how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are represented in all sorts of spheres, media, through education, discourse, I think is really critical. And then it's about saying, well, what can I act upon? What is something within my control that I can do to act upon and contribute to change? And then they can be quite little things, like knowing the country you're on, to quite big things about structural change, about policy change, about sometimes knowing when to step back so Indigenous peoples can take their lead. We've always been self-determining. Structures can help us continue, to assist us in being further self-determining. But we've never lost that essence. And in terms of the question before, Jane, as well, about, I know as a mother as well, I do not have the right to take the hopefulness for our future generation. So therefore, I have a responsibility to help change what the future could be. We wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for our cultural heroes, if it wasn't for our elders, and if it wasn't for our cultural warriors. So we have to have hope. We have to have hopeful conversations. And so for me, that's really critical.
Kyam?
I think Uncle Richie hit the nail on the head. It's about learning and understanding. It's about read about the colonial past. Get involved in community groups. Visit Shona's organisation's website at Reconciliation SA. There are always events on. There are always ways to learn and get involved. I was a couple of weeks ago. I spent an evening at the Blackwood Reconciliation Group, which might even be it's 20-something years old, one of the longest running, if not the oldest running community reconciliation group in Australia. Find like-minded people in your area and get together and learn and understand. I think that really is the key.
Okay, we've got some questions coming through, so I'd like to involve our audience both in the room and an audience that might be watching. Our first question is from Ian. Acknowledgement of country sometimes includes elders past and present, sometimes adds emerging. What is the preference and what are the pros and cons in that acknowledgement of country again, language. It's all about the language. Do you want past, present and emerging acknowledged? Is it a variable or is there a standard? What's the pros and cons of those?
So I'm happy to address that one. So I think the important thing is when you acknowledge country, you're acknowledging the people of the past, the people that are there. But with the future and the emerging, when you do this, and I actually thought about this one quite a bit. My two children I have are just in their early 20s, and I've trained my son to do Welcome to Country, but I am there to oversee when he does Welcome to Country that he's doing it correctly and that I can provide feedback to him. So quite often, part of our learning, I would have an uncle overseeing me undertaking cultural activities. And so when you're talking about emerging and acknowledgement, I'm also looking at the audience, and I want the audience to know, this is my son, this is my daughter. So you should treat them with the respect that you should treat me. And that's what happened in my father's time and my uncles and my aunties. This is how we learn. And that's one of the special things that we can offer about learning, that we'll take you under our wing and we'll show you the bigger picture about what can be not only taught, how we teach, but how we learn as well.
And it's important. Sorry, Kyam.
I was just going to say, and it's about what it means to you. I think some people feel that they're going through the motions when acknowledging country in a very formulaic way that's written down. There's not something that's the absolute correct way to do things, and people have different connections and different ways they want to acknowledge, and I think that's fine. And in fact, I reckon the best ever Welcome to Country I've seen was a couple of years ago when, during COVID, the AFL reconciliation round, the Richmond Essendon Dreamtime game was played in Darwin, and Uncle Richie's had about 80 billion YouTube views off for his magnificent Welcome to Country he did then.
I'll have to make it 80 million and one. It's important too to make a distinction, isn't it, between Welcome to Country, which can only be performed by an elder, or an emerging, or a traditional owner or a custodian, versus an acknowledgement.
Yeah.
So I can never do a Welcome to Country, and nor should I, because I'm not an Indigenous person, but I can do an acknowledgement and recognise the country that I'm on, which is what I did at the beginning. So it's important, I think, that
you distinguish
we
between
understand
the two.
That. Yes,
and so
there's a big difference.
It's also understanding, and this is part of our learning, because actually after I did that Welcome to Country, I received a phone call, and this is a true story. I was actually asked to do the Welcome to Country for the grand final. And I said, where are they having the grand final? And they said, Brisbane. And I said, well, I'm not doing it.
I can't.
And they said, why? I said, that's not my country. I can't speak for that country.
Which is an education for them in itself, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, to understand that a welcome to country has to be by somebody from that country. And otherwise, it's an acknowledgement by someone. I've always enjoyed, on Ghana land, I've always enjoyed the Welcome to Country from Uncle Lewis O'Brien, because he always manages to combine both his heritages. He always tells a really bad joke from his Irish background, and then he acknowledges, welcomes them to Ghana country. And I always think that's a wonderful thing too, an acknowledgement of his dual backgrounds, and the way it breaks the ice enormously and makes people feel very comfortable with. Kyam, I think you're right. I think some people feel that they have to acknowledge country, but if people do it without the heart, you shouldn't do it at all. Is that a view?
I think it goes to the point that Shona said as well. We are very deeply considered people. So then when you're enacting the acknowledgement, you actually need to think deeply about it. It's not just the words
Read
on the
the
page.
words.
It's actually really thinking about what that acknowledgement really means. So that's the relational part to the statement, which takes a considered approach. So I think it needs to be the next step. It needs to think, why am I really saying this? What does it really mean? But what does it mean for change?
You were demurring a moment there when I said, if people are just going to read the words, perhaps they shouldn't bother.
I like acknowledgements. I think, I don't think anybody who really doesn't want to acknowledge their own country for whatever reason they've got would read words. And I think sometimes people find it hard to step into that space because they don't want to do something wrong. They don't want to say something that's wrong and offend people, which is fine. I think I'd much prefer a sort of a formula acknowledgement to country, someone acknowledging country, than nothing at all.
Okay.
And I think it makes these people who are worried about maybe they don't think they know enough about the area to say words.
So the familiarity of it, the more we do it, the more accepted it becomes, the more people feel comfortable with it. And those that are anxious get less anxious. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think so.
Yeah, look, I was just going to build on that because there's two things I'd say. Like, we do a lot of things in schools, and we talk to them about a gratefulness puzzle. We do a gratefulness puzzle with the kids around what makes living on this land so special to you, and that goes to the thing is who's the acknowledgement for? Because it's not about making sure you follow. Yes, it is protocols. It's not about making you feel good or making you feel comfortable. Let's flip it on the head from First Nations perspective. As an Aboriginal person sitting in that room, hearing someone say, "I'm grateful to be on this country. I am so grateful to benefit from your custodianship for tens of thousands of years. I am grateful for the benefit I have and the privilege I have to be in one of the greatest countries in the world." And that's what this is about. It's about expressing your gratefulness in this space. And if I can get a 5-year-old to do it, I can get a 55-year-old to do it and mean it with the same intent. And I think understanding its role in relationships and just, humbling yourself to the fact that it's just good manners, and it's a really, really beautiful thing to do to symbolise your gratefulness about the legacy that's been here before, way before, European settlement happened.
Good point. And that goes back to that point that you mentioned earlier. It's about language, isn't it? It's about perhaps changing that language. And if you are anxious about the formality of the language, then change it around and say, "I'm really grateful to be here today on Kaurna land, and I acknowledge the wonderful work that's been done for thousands of years on this land by the people who were here before me."
Thank you for your acknowledgement.
Yeah. Well, thank you for educating me further on how I can improve it.
It doesn't need to be a formal thing to start meetings or speeches all the time. I've seen some really good examples at dinners where someone's, instead of saying a formal Christian grace, has talked about acknowledging the food we're eating tonight's grown on land. The custodian of the ship of the land over thousands of years has allowed us to have a meal here. So there are different spaces and different ways that you can acknowledge the tens of thousands of years of custodianship of the land and how that's got to where we are now as well.
And I think I've learned something this morning, just then, that it's okay to not stick to some sort of protocol version of that I have permission to go around that as someone who can't do or wouldn't do welcome, but I can acknowledge it in whatever way makes it particular to me. And as you say, in a religious way, perhaps you can acknowledge the spirituality or do it in a different way. It doesn't have to be, I acknowledge the Kaurna elders from past, present and emerging. So that's okay for us to sort of do a bit of stand-up, not comedy, I'm not being silly, but, to riff on it a bit rather than stick to a formal set of words.
Yeah, one of the things about my welcome to country when I do it is it's never the same.
Yeah, never the same twice.
I have almost a standard beginning and a standard end, but depending on that event I'm in, you fit that scenario.
Yeah, and that's what Uncle Lewis used to do too. But I do love to hear a welcome to country in language if that's available. I think it always resounds powerfully when you hear it in language, and then very generously get a translation so that you know what's going on. Let's take another... Sorry.
I just wanted to add, a most beautiful moment was, because Uncle Lewis Yellowburg O'Brien is is our elder on campus on Kaurna country, on Kaurna Yata. And when we brought our 3 elders together, which is also Auntie Pat Miller from Aranda country in Alice Springs, Uncle Richie asked Uncle Lewis if he could speak on his country. And it was the most powerful moment for me to watch Uncle Richie as an elder speak to Uncle Lewis and ask, "Uncle, can I speak on that country?" And actually felt quite emotional. And I thought, that is protocol.
Yeah. And that's something we can teach people.
Yes, indeed. I'm sure you've taught many. Just this discussion is helping teach people things. We've got a question from Gail. And thank you to the people who are supplying questions for us. What needs to be done in high school education to ensure First Nations students are supported and ready to take up cybersecurity tech career pathway opportunities? That's a very specific question, but I think the first part of that question is a very general thing, is what needs to be done in high school to support and to ensure First Nations students are supported and ready to take up that particular career and others?
I mean, from my perspective, the first thing is that everyone needs to feel like they belong. So schools, higher education, sectors, institutions, you need to feel that you're represented within those spaces. So that's about the physical presence, it's about acknowledgements or welcomes to country, it's about how the curriculum is focused, and it's actually saying these perspectives are valued within this space. So I think that's the first part to that answer. The second part about cybersecurity, well, we have a digital age and kids are really good at it. So probably they're going to be far more advanced than any of us because of that knowledge. And we need Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in all spaces, including cybersecurity. I don't think we should be narrow in how we see our community. In fact, our community can be anywhere. And so it's just about supporting those aspirations. But also in schooling systems, recognising perhaps where there are structural barriers and where we need to change those barriers. And we talked about language before. The inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages in schools is also about embedding philosophies, because in language there are philosophies. And those philosophies are relational to country. So there are lots of ways that we can do that. And also just having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives in the curriculum, because that knowledge benefits all school children and then our community. And they're our future leaders.
Indeed. Kyam, let's go back to this government perspective, because you're now in charge of the department. You also have a colleague who sits alongside you who's the Minister for Education. How much within Cabinet and within government, how easy or difficult is it to get your department to speak to the Department for Education and get the sorts of things that we're talking about that need to happen even in our preschools? How easy is it to get your department to inform the Education Department?
It's not difficult, and I've already had 3 or 4 conversations with Blair Boyer, who's the new Education Minister, and a pretty good friend about what is it we can do? Are there anything we can look around what they do in other parts of Australia and indeed other parts of the world, New Zealand or Canada in particular, in terms of that cultural and language education. I think it's been said here already. When you learn a language, you don't just learn what the word for a tree or word for a kangaroo is. You learn about a culture necessarily as part of learning that language. It's so intrinsic to identity. So it is something we're having a look at, and having those conversations aren't hard. Implementing big structural change, that's difficult.
That's what I was getting at, yes. How hard is it to get it to happen?
But I that's a part of what I think we now talk about truth-telling. It's about having the education and the understanding of culture, and that informs.
Because one of those things is, we were talking before about colonialism and how we haven't had that. I don't think we have had those really hard conversations. And I'm of a generation and from Queensland, and I'm now going to have to find out, I think it is in the deep, dark recesses of my mind, what country I grew up on. I feel very connected to that country in my way, but I'd love to know what the Indigenous culture was there before me. But I grew up in a time when my social studies, as it was called, that's how old I am, social studies in Queensland was the teaching of explorers. It was the teaching of opening up of the country. It was the teaching of Captain Cook, Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson, Leichhardt, Burke and Wills, all of that sort of thing. Curriculum has to be addressed, does it not, about if we're ever to change the message around what happened in the colonial past and even in the near past, the number of people that don't understand what happened in 67, the number of people that don't understand for how long Australian Indigenous people were not citizens is staggering to me. So that has to be curriculum change, doesn't it, within our education system?
Yeah, it does. Certainly, in my lifetime already, I've seen change in what's taught in schools and what people know about. And it is really, really important. It's not just important for in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to learn about all aspects of the past and about culture, but it's also important for Aboriginal kids in school. It's I think it's one of the bigger changes I've probably seen in the last 20 or 30 years is young Aboriginal people being much more comfortable taking pride in who they are and their culture, and that change in curriculum, that change in teaching, I think allows that to happen as well, and that's really important.
Yes. Yeah. Look, and I think I'm going a little bit further into that space. One of the important parts, and ACARA and the ATSL standards, they are all tools that are activated that guide the national teaching curriculum in Australia. So obviously systemically, you got your federal and your state play in that space, which is really important. It's also about how that is delivered in the schools. So this is why the conversation, we're talking about voice before, why it's so important that that's included in this conversation, because I don't believe that our amazing teachers that they are have necessarily been able to gather the intel and the confidence to be able to execute some of these learnings to the depth that they need to as educators. And that's where the higher institutions come into it. It's a beast of a topic, and a really, really important one. We at Reconciliation SA have, and Simone's on with us on that journey, have an industry network group that looks at, early into, the babies, the ones still in nappies, all the way through to tertiary institutions around how we have conversations about reconciliation, inclusivity of First Nations education and curriculum, and we do delve into that. But it is a really big topic that needs to be delved into. Our conversations with teachers are a whole bunch of things, from we don't know enough, we don't feel confident teaching this, I don't know if I'm saying it the right way. So we have that conversation. But then let's not forget that we also have conversations with the kids, who I can tell you the two big topics that they talk about right today, as in earlier this week I had conversations with them, were race relations in school and their safety as Aboriginal children at school, their emotional, physical and psychological safety, and deterioration of mental health based on, I suppose, negative experiences around race relation. And the second one was around, obviously, their learning about their culture from people that matter and know their culture. They're they're highly sophisticated conversations, and our kids are up for it. I can tell you, if you want to talk about brave, our kids are brave, and they are wanting and to soak this up and go into this space, and they are fearless. But at the same time, I also hear their conversations around, but we need to help the school do it. So their graciousness and wanting to be the teachers of the teachers is something that I'm really proud of. And to hear students from across private, Catholic, independent and public schools all have that same conversation, I think is really heartening. And that's when you talk about hope before. That's why I have great faith that we will navigate our way through this space, but it is about us and the system enabling that and changing the trajectory that has been set before.
Another question, this time from Sarah. Truth-telling is key, but how do we, especially non-Aboriginal people, ensure we are deep listening to trauma and colonialism being alive and well today? That is a very deep question and a very difficult one to answer. Kyam, have you got a thought on that? How truth-telling has been, that term has been used in a number of cultures. I think of South Africa. I think there's been a process in Canada as well, and you alluded to that earlier. Has there been in Australia a genuine, or can you give me, or can you think of any examples of where there has been some truth-telling in Australia? Did the stolen generation, the conversation around that, did that bring some truth-telling to that part of the story? Are there other examples like that?
Yeah, a little bit, but not enough. I can remember, it would have been 15 or 20 years ago, being in an exhibition in the museum on North Terrace, and it had artworks at this exhibition museum from members of the stolen generations. And there was one that just simply said, "It all happened." And it struck me that someone whose experiences is doubted that much, that they feel the need to
Make that an artwork.
To make that an artwork, but to say, I'm not believed, it all happened to me, shows we've got a long way to come. We had a Stolen Generations reparation scheme in South Australia. I think Tasmania was the first state, then South Australia, a few years ago, and it gave ex gratia payments of small amounts of money, because no amount's going to make up for tearing someone away from their culture and their family. But what was reported from that process, it wasn't those small amounts of money, it was having someone sit down and listen to people talk about, and sometimes for the first time completely, their experiences, and be able to do that and be believed, because it all happened.
That's a common feature of trauma. Is the first step is to have your experience believed and acknowledged. So that was clear. I do remember that. I remember that happening. So you said earlier that would have been at the time you were minister under the Weatherall government. So we fast forwarded to 2021. Is there anything that you can see on the horizon where you can forward that truth-telling perhaps in a broader way that the government plans?
There is, and we will do that. There's a lot of conversations to happen about how that's done first. And I think in the sort of sequencing of how that's done, particularly from the Uluru Statement, that voice is critical first, because without that voice, you'll go in quickly and rush into a truth-telling process that might not get exactly what...
Be considered, as Uncle Richie said.
How it should be done to the best it can be done.
So the other part of that is, I'm just going back to Sarah's question. So how do we, especially non-Aboriginal people, ensure we do the deep listening? So that is to step back, to engage, step back, shut up and listen carefully, and perhaps do it over and over again?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot in that, and I think there's a lot in that, and I'll have that conversation. And Simone's obviously an expert in talking about truth-telling in artistic forms, and in that space. So I think what's really important is we've been asked to talk about our trauma a lot, and let's keep that in mind. Often our society likes to look at our institutions, our schooling systems, our uni systems to do the teaching. I encourage people to think beyond our institutions as the only place that you can learn. I think what's important in the truth-telling process is to take some responsibility about your own personal learning and not rely on our existing very formal institutions to do that for us. There are many ways that you can learn about First Nations histories and truth-telling opportunities in Australia, in South Australia, with your local council, with your local community, in artistic forms, and I'll let Simone talk about that if in that space. But we won't have time.
No, we've taken up all the time.
Yeah,
but
it's about personal responsibility in looking in that space, and that's what you can do today or tomorrow or the next day, is think about where can you access that information, and take some responsibility on yourself in doing that learning and expanding your knowledge.
Don't expect
and if I can, by doing so, by becoming a keen learner, you can become an advocate for change in that space, and that supports us. And that supports you, that supports your learning. And that means we go together as one community, one multicultural community that acknowledges we're made up of all these different groups. That's what, to me, Australia should be about.
A very positive way to finish the conversation. Thank you all very, very much. We have, I think, run out of time now. I've been getting a very frantic wind-up from the side that I was doing my best to ignore, because I very much enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for your investment in what has been, I hope, a fearless conversation. Thank you to the Honourable Kyam Maher, the South Australia's Attorney-General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, to Associate Professor Simone, as well to Uncle Richie for joining us from his country up north, where it's much warmer than it is down here.
I'm loving the cooler weather too.
Oh, good. And also to Shona Reed from Reconciliation SA. I'd also like to thank our audience for your interest in this fearless conversation. And remember, it can keep going on Twitter for as long as you like it to, using the Fearless Conversations hashtag. And you'll be able to watch this session again on the Flinders YouTube channel or the Flinders University's Fearless Conversations webpage. And we also hope that you'll be able to join us at another time for a conversation like this on another topic. And thank you all for being involved. Particular thanks to our very brave and fearless participants. And thank you for your participation today. Good afternoon.